Hi, everyone. If you could all please find your seats. Actually, yeah, looks like there's not a ton, which is awesome. So, standing room only for this one. We'll get started with this workshop. Thank you, everyone, for joining us at this workshop for the 2025 MIT Sloan Sports Analytics Conference. My name's Colton Michelle. I'm a first-year MBA student at MIT Sloan. It is my pleasure to introduce Behind the Deal, the Analytics of Sports Sponsorship Valuation, presented by Wasserman. Here to help lead us through this workshop is Keegan Feardle, Associate Vice President of Performance and Insights. So let's all please give Keegan a big round of applause.
All right. How we doing? Good? Good. Okay, perfect. I'm Keegan. I'm an Associate Vice President here at Wasserman on our Performance and Insights team. We see deals from both the brands and the properties side. So quite a unique situation in regards to some other panels you've probably heard at the conference. So what we're going to go through today is actually the analytics behind how sports sponsorships are priced and valued, and we're actually going to look at it from both the properties and the brand side and try and figure out how they look at them differently. You're going to see a ton of Bengals content in here. I'm not affiliated with the team in any way besides being a very avid fan. So there's no real numbers in here. Don't come at me if anybody works for the Bengals in here. I'm sorry. But I am willing to talk about the Trey Hendrickson deal. So if anybody wants to talk about that after the conference, please come and talk to me. All right, perfect. So we're going to start with a quick exercise, and we're going to look at the Paycor Stadium naming rights deal that the Cincinnati Bengals did 2 years ago, and we're actually going to use this as an example throughout the entire presentation. So for those that are unaware, this is called a naming rights or a venue entitlement deal, and especially for NFL teams, it's actually one of the most expensive sponsorship packages in sports. You can equate this to things like your front of kit, uniform deals, your jersey patch sponsorships, et cetera, but you obviously only have one venue that you can name. Some have a practice facility, et cetera, but it is a really, really valuable asset for teams, especially those in the NFL. So I want you guys to take 20 seconds or so and write down on your laptops or books or et cetera, what you think this asset and its associated sponsorship package would be worth. So not what you think it would be priced at, but how valuable you think this package would be. So just take 20 seconds. All right, cool. So we've got that number. Secondly, how much do you think this partnership package is actually sold for as a percentage of that? So write that number down second. I actually don't have an answer for this in this presentation, to be honest with you. So there is no wrong numbers. There's no right numbers. Anybody can try and quote me on this. I'd probably put it around $4 million would probably be what I would. But take a look and write that down, and we're going to come back to that kind of at the end, and you guys can use the information that we go through in this presentation to see if you want to change that number or if anything has changed to help you figure that out. As you can imagine, there is a relationship between the two of these things. So what this asset is actually worth and how it is priced. But funnily enough, it's actually not as strong as you might think. Does anybody have a guess on maybe why that might be? Anybody want to take a guess? Okay, well, we'll go into it. So, yeah, you want to guess?
Maybe because it's an emotional decision on the brand's part.
Yeah, that's actually a really good factor. We don't actually get into a ton of intangibles in here, but it's a really, really good factor. There is a ton of stuff at play that creates that disconnect, and the intangibles like emotional decisions, handshakes, relationships between executives, et cetera, is all stuff that plays into this pricing. So we're going to take the next 20 minutes and imagine that you guys are a part of the Cincinnati Bengals front office when this was called Paul Brown Stadium. Okay, so this was before the Paycor deal was done, right? There was no naming rights in place. So think about that for the next 20 to 30 minutes as we go through this process. And we're actually not going to go into a ton of detail with this because this is not what this is about in terms of this session, but I did want to give some kind of context on how you actually build a partnership package for those in the room that don't understand. So very, very simply, rights holders have a series of assets that they have access to as part of their stadium, their digital ecosystem, et cetera. You can see these 6 on the right here are very common ones. You know, your television assets, hospitality, you've got your signage in venue, your brand ambassadors, et cetera, et cetera. But what they typically do is they will grab those assets and they'll lump them all into what we call call a package. Normally, these are fairly standardized across the industry. A lot of partnership packages actually look really similar, but more savvy rights holders or more savvy brands will typically be able to either negotiate or tweak those packages to better meet objectives. So very kind of standard process, as there is a ton of stuff that goes actually into building partnership packages and a lot of analytics and data behind how they're priced. We're not going to go into that too much here, but did just want to set that stage so that you guys have an understanding of how that process goes. What we're going to start looking at, however, is how this package is assigned a value / price specifically. And there's 3 kind of pillars here that we're going to look at. These 3 typically intermingle with each other. Okay, they're not necessarily exclusive. So let's start with this first one here. This isn't actually a term that we're going to look at again because it's not commonly used within the industry, but we're going to call it asset cost value. And that is the assets that we just looked at as a part of that partnership package. Each asset in the deal is given a value based on how much it would cost to buy on the open market. So if you have an LED field board, it's priced based on how much we think that LED field board would sell for. Super simple. Secondly, we have a lot of packages or a lot of assets in general that are actually assigned price based on how similar deals are selling and taking into consideration such as market and strength of IP. So if you have that the Dallas Cowboys have just sold their naming rights deal to AT&T, and that's sold for, I don't know, $15 million. You could take that as an example and be like, okay, I'm the Bengals, I'm not quite the Cowboys, right? So how do I take in my market strength and my strength of IP and adjust my price knowing that a similar asset was done for $15 million? So that's kind of second way. And then thirdly, we're actually going to go through this in a little bit of detail later, but supply and demand can actually have huge fluctuations on price. As with any kind of good, any kind of service, certain factors that impact supply, so things like number of categories that are available, the scarcity of an asset in a package, or demand, so the competitiveness of a brand category, can all impact that price at the end of the day. So as I said, these 3 really intermingle with each other and work together to ultimately create that price / value. They're not necessarily exclusive from each other. Cool. So what I want you guys to do is we have 4 very kind of basic assets here for the Cincinnati Bengals. I want you guys to take one of these and write it down, and that's going to be your asset, okay? So you can either take this upper deck signage, which is a very simple kind of signage asset at the top of the concourse here. We have an activation footprint, the second one, pouring rights, which is a huge right for the stadium, and then a hospitality suite. So just want you guys to pick one of those and write down what you think a property would price this at, and then just think about why you would price it that way. So take a second to really just think about that. And then we'll move on in 10 seconds from now. Cool. So before we get further in this process, we're going to introduce a concept, which we're going to hear a lot about over the next 10 slides or so, called media equivalency valuation. Okay? This starts from a pricing perspective. When we're trying to price assets that have a level of exposure to them, or they deliver impressions, et cetera, so you can think about a lot of your signage assets, your content assets, et cetera, a rights holder typically looks at to understand the media equivalent value of that asset and uses that as a guide to pricing, or depending on the asset itself, sometimes that media equivalency becomes the price itself. Most of that value that a rights holder generates in a partnership package is actually through assets that deliver this media equivalency value. We'll get to what it is in a second, but just keep that in mind. So this kind of actually does act as a little bit of a de facto currency in the sponsorship world. So anybody here who has worked in the industry for a long time definitely knows this term or some variation of this term. And then finally, an important thing to keep in mind as we work through this, and we're going to get to this a little later in the presentation, but media equivalency actually creates, I would say, an unequal playing field. Okay, so rights holders that can actually generate media equivalency better than others normally have an easier time justifying their pricing to a partner than those that don't. So what is media equivalency? This is a very kind of simple example, but it is a data-backed methodology that attempts to assign value to an asset by comparing it to traditional media assets. Okay, so let's take this Coca-Cola example on the right. Okay, they've placed this TV commercial. Okay, in a random broadcast, let's say, that TV commercial costs them $5,000 to buy that media space. Okay, they go to a media agency, they pay them money, and they place it within this broadcast. So on the bottom here, you have, I'm assuming this is from the ICC Champions Cup that was a couple of weeks ago, you actually have Coca-Cola appearing in that stadium, okay, as a part of their sponsorship deal. This obviously isn't bought in the same way, right? We have gone out and we've purchased this as part of those packages that we talked about earlier. There is actually no specific price/value for this, at least from the Coca-Cola side. So the question that we have is, how much value is the brand actually receiving through their sponsorship by the logo showing up during a live broadcast, okay? And that's what we're dealing with here from a media equivalency perspective. This is actually really advantageous for rights holders in a way, because it actually allows sponsorships to be compared to media companies in a very similar way, okay? So it does even the playing field from that perspective. When we're looking at it from a holistic marketing perspective, the two are comparable in those regards, okay? So we're going to look back at that upper deck signage that we were talking about before, that first asset on the page of our package. So that upper deck signage, even though it is in the stadium, it can appear in a ton of different ways, okay? So we're seeing right here, highlights of the game on ESPN, that upper deck signage can appear. Social media clips that the Bengals post, it can appear there. In online news articles, for people actually in the stadium attending it, they can see that signage. And then finally, obviously, during a live broadcasted game. So I think it was a little hard to see. We'll try and see it again, if we can click through here. There is actually a Paycor exposure at the very end of this clip, of this field goal. So you can see this here, right at the top, Paycor in their upper deck signage. So what we're going to do is actually go through the process now of trying to figure out that Paycor exposure, similar to thinking about how we were thinking about it with Coca-Cola, how we're actually going to calculate this media equivalency value, okay? So every single time an asset, in our example, this upper deck LED shows a sponsor brand, and it is picked up on one of these mediums, it generates what's called an impression. An impression is a media term for just something showing up to somewhere, okay, very simple. In the advertising world, for those that don't know, most media is actually bought based on the amount of impressions that it will deliver. So if an asset is going to deliver $1 million, it is typically priced in a way called cost per 1,000 impressions, and you will pay $30 for those million impressions, or $300 for those million impressions, etc. ME value tries to combine these two ideas, okay? It is a monetary value that represents how much each impression delivered through the asset in which it showcases the brand, so in this regard, Paycor, how much it would cost to buy in a comparable traditional media asset. Okay, so this is the question that we're trying to answer here. This Paycor exposure appeared during a broadcast where there were 10 million viewers. It therefore delivered 10 million impressions, right? There are 10 million people watching Paycor come up on the screen here. How much would those impressions cost? Does anybody have an idea? Anybody? $35, okay, good guess. Anybody else? Yeah. $3,000, okay, cool. $40,000, okay, we got a good range. $35, $3,000, $40,000. Okay, so this happened during a live broadcast. So we're going to go back to our idea of how we actually calculate this equivalency. We need to figure out what its equivalent media asset is, okay? So this exposure of Paycor happened in a live broadcast, and as that exposure happened in a live broadcast, its equivalent media asset is a 30-second TV commercial. Super simple, okay? This is actually the methodology we use to calculate media equivalency value. This is, like, feel free to take photos. It's not super proprietary. Everybody does this the same way in the industry, despite what people say. It's a very, very simple kind of 5-part formula. There is some variations to how this data is gathered, some other ways that people use this methodology, et cetera, but it is very standard throughout the industry because, as we are saying, it is a standardized number that we use. So let's go through this methodology here. So we have, starting with 1, is the number of exposures we're actually calculating for, okay? So Paycor has appeared on the screen 1 time. If we were to do a valuation over the course of an entire game, this could be 300, 400, whatever it is, right? But we're just calculating 1 exposure here. The second is that impression number that we were talking about before, okay? So that's 10 million. We've already said that was the viewers of the game and how many people were tuned into the live broadcast. The third number, so we're going to take that 10 million, we're going to divide it by the media equivalent CPM. So how expensive it would be to buy 1,000 impressions in a 30-second broadcast commercial during that game, okay? This number, there's tons of publicly available benchmarks for it. It's not particularly crazy information. It is relatively easy to get, but we're going to take that $30 CPM, and then we're going to apply a couple of discounts to that because we don't agree that that Paycor exposure is worth the same as a 30-second commercial, right? You can't control the message that is in that asset. It is small. It's kind of blurry. Most people probably aren't even going to notice it, right? So what we do is we actually create some discounts on top of that. So we have a discount here for length. we look at this, we're comparing it to a 30-second commercial, and this was a 2-second exposure, so we're applying a 0.2 discount in regards to that. And then finally, we apply what's called a quality discount. For anybody that works in the industry, QI score, media equivalency score, et cetera, there's a ton of terms for it, but visibility discount is what we can kind of tag it as here. So 25%, so we're heavily discounting that. So we're gonna take that methodology, and $3,000 was actually really close. This was worth $5,000 of media equivalent value, this 2-second exposure for Paycor, okay? Or alternatively, this exposure would cost the brand, this is very much a mouthful, but really important to understand. This exposure of Paycor would cost the brand $5,000 to buy if they were going to advertise their brand in a 30-second TV commercial during this game instead. And that is really important to remember, okay? We're not saying that this thing is worth $5,000. You are not getting $5,000 back from this exposure appearing, okay? This is just how much you would have to pay. It's not even necessarily saying whether it's good for the brand, right? It's just saying that this is how much it would cost to pay for on the open market. Question, if you were a marketing manager, I'm gonna go back to you because you were really, really close on this. If you were a marketing manager for Paycor, would you pay $5,000 for this exposure? No, okay? I think that's a good answer, but the correct answer here is really maybe. And it's kind of a bit of a cop-out answer, but it all comes down to what we expect of an asset like this, okay? If you are spending $5,000 on this to generate awareness of your brand amongst Bengals fans, I think you could argue that it might be worthwhile, okay? That's a very, very specific objective, but in this case, you would be executing on that very, very well. If you were expecting it to land you a massive contract with a key regional mid-sized business, because you're Paycor and that's what generates business for your business, it's probably a waste, just being honest. It's like that is not where you would put $5,000 to do that. You would probably put that in hospitality or some kind of lead generation effort, et cetera, not on a piece of signage that just puts your name up on the upper level deck for 2 seconds. How we're going to round out this kind of valuation section, we're not going to go through these crazy methodologies for the rest of them, because to be honest with you, the other 3 assets that we looked at are much simpler, okay? So let's take the activation space. For something like an activation space, normally the way that this is calculated is just on the equivalent cost of the actual space, okay? So if you are giving your brand a 10 by 10 space, what would it cost to buy a 10 by 10 space in the stadium on the open market? Normally that's just kind of like $1,000 per square foot. I'm sure there are people out there who have better data than I do on that, but it's pretty simple, right? It is just how much. If the property or the rights holder is actually putting on the activation and the experience, normally what there will be is a cost for fabrication, a cost for the labor that goes into that, et cetera, et cetera. Some rights holders as well, and I think that they should be doing this 100%, is also they'll add media equivalency value or some kind of engagement value on the top of that for all of those within the stadium that are actually seeing or engaging with that experience, okay? So that is not going to drive a ton of media equivalency value by any means because you're just limited on how many people are in the stadium, but there should be credit given for those people that see it that way. The other 2 assets we looked at, so the suite, very simple. We just use a face value of the asset for this, right? How much it would cost you to buy an actual ticket for the suite. And then finally, something like pouring rights, we actually look at the revenue that it will normally deliver back to the sponsor itself. That is typically very easy to model, right? A drink sells for $5 and we sell 1 million drinks per year. Very, very easy to model, but it's also quite a specific situation because you just don't have a lot of those rights. So you can probably already start to sense the problem at play here with using media equivalency, right? We are getting to a point where rights holders are beholden on using these assets that are focused on awareness to actually justify their pricing. So let's look on these 4 ones that we just talked about here. That upper level deck signage, or whatever we want to call it, this could feasibly be valued at probably $200,000 across the course of the season. I would actually argue maybe even more on the fact that that was a $5,000 thing, and it was a 2-second exposure. You're probably getting multiple of those a game. It's appearing in social media. You've got the in-venue exposure, et cetera. So you're looking at $200,000 to maybe $400,000 for that singular asset. Then we move over to the activation space. As we were talking about, it's just difficult to really push the value on these because you're limited on the amount of concourse space you have. A 10 by 10 space is $10,000 or whatever it is. You're going to struggle to get past $20,000 for an activation space just because of that limitation. Pouring rights, on the other hand, as we were talking about, can actually be really valuable. If every soda you sell is worth $5 and they pour 20,000 a game, that is a ton of business back and a ton of value you're creating for a brand sponsor. But you typically only have 2 of these to sell, normally a soft drink pouring right and some kind of liquor or alcohol pouring right. So you're just limited on your ability to bring in revenue using this in general. And then finally, if we look at all of your kind of hospitality assets and things like that, a suite, although valuable, you can only really include 1 suite in a package, and its face value of 1 to 3K per game. It just doesn't have the ability to create that value in the same way. So what we end up having is kind of a situation like this, which is the valuation system that really exists within the industry right now. This is what most sponsorship packages look like. You have 85% of the value is media equivalency value. 15% is value of hard costs, so that activation footprint, those tickets, et cetera, and then we don't have any business back value because you just don't have a lot of rights to use. So this is pretty much what you're looking at for most packages that exist within sponsorships right now. And as we said, this actually does have some benefits, but it really has some drawbacks as well. So on the benefits side, rights holders who actually have the ability to deliver high value exposures have a really easy job justifying price sometimes. So we're actually going to talk about an example with the NBA in a little bit. The NBA is a perfect example. They have a ton of games across the season, good viewership, great social engagement. So their ability to actually create media equivalency value is very high. It also, as we were kind of talking about, allows sponsorship marketing to compete with traditional media buys, which evens the playing field in marketing, which is super nice. But on the other side, rights holders that don't have this ability struggle to justify a price very significantly. Women's sports is the perfect example of this until their media rights changed about 1 to 2 years ago. WNBA teams and NWSL teams had a really hard time justifying their price despite really high engagement and their ability to move the needle on performance metrics. And this is the most important kind of trend that we're going to see across the rest of this is media equivalency value does not equal performance, okay? Just because you are delivering $10 million of media equivalency doesn't actually do necessarily anything for purchase intent or consideration or the ability to move revenue. But the problem is because pricing is based on media equivalency to an extent, the two are intrinsically linked, right? It is a leading indicator and it is really it suggests that the two are heavily correlated. So let's look at an example here. I'm going to use the Bengals and the Cowboys again. Sponsorship A here, we have a sponsorship that costs somebody $500,000. It reaches 10 million people, but it has a really strong impact on brand consideration. So you've seen that increase for the sponsor by 10% after year 1. This is a great sponsorship, really, really good performance. On the right-hand side, you have a sponsorship that's really efficient in its reach. So it only costs $1 million, but it reaches 30 million. So it's more efficient than the one on the left. But after 2 years, this hasn't actually done anything for the sponsor. The needle hasn't moved at all. Consideration is exactly the same. So what you're seeing here is this really well-performing sponsorship. Sponsorship A, very effective at moving the needle. Sponsorship B is really efficient, but it doesn't move the needle. This actually results normally in a situation where sponsorship B is going to be priced higher than sponsorship A, okay? Because going back to that media equivalency, let's take the Bengals and the Cowboys. The Bengals have less fans, they have less nationally televised games. Their ability to generate media equivalency value is significantly less than the Cowboys on the right, who have a ton of fans, great reach, more nationally televised games, and more media equivalency value. These stats are not real. I don't know if the Cincinnati Bengals move the needle better than the Dallas Cowboys. I would suggest probably not. But it's just a good thing to understand is that the industry is so heavily based on these efficiency metrics that there's not really a comparison, and the Bengals in this case will always be priced lower than the Cowboys because of that ability to reach people. Let's look at some kind of other impacts on pricing to close this out. So it's not just media equivalency value, it's not just the market price of assets, there's also supply and demand, or scarcity or ample supply. That can really drive a package's price up or down. So let's take our Bengals example. There is only one Joe Burrow, okay? So that is probably going to drive the pricing up in a sense. Demand is a very similar kind of factor on this as well. Cincinnati is a market with tons of Fortune 500 companies. They are trying to secure certain deals. So hospitality assets in that market are probably more expensive than in other markets because they have significant use for it. So that drives outsized demand. There's some other things like external factors like new categories. So beauty is really getting into sports right now. So that's a driving factor, could be on beauty sponsorships, specifically in price. Hot categories, crypto in 2021. If anybody wants to talk about working on FTX in 2021, find me after the conference. It was pretty crazy. And then economic factors. So things like COVID can obviously really impact pricing as well, right? So it is not just that media equivalency, it's not just that market pricing, but you have to bring in these factors of supply and demand like Joe Burrow and the market of Cincinnati as well. Just to round out this section on kind of price and value from the rights holder side, supply and demand also acts as a price regulator, which is quite interesting. So we've got some good examples on the left here of CarMax and DoorDash, who are the front of shirt sponsors for Angel City and Gotham FC. Women's sports teams actually deliver generally less contractual value because their ability to reach fans is just lower than men's sports teams, mainly due to the outdated media rights deals that they were on. But multiple teams have actually managed to sell packages way beyond that media equivalency value due to the significant demand within the marketplace for women's sports sponsorships. I would also argue their ability to move the needle as well, right? That is another underlying factor, but demand has had a huge impact on the pricing of these specifically. We talked about this very briefly from the NBA side, but because the NBA has a long season with high viewership and social exposure potential, the league has an outsized ability to drive contractual value through ME. However, there is really limited supply in terms of brands who can just afford $20 million sponsorship packages. So this puts a ceiling, right, on the price of NBA sponsorships. There are just not 100 brands out there that compete for those deals. So really what you see with the NBA is a much higher value media equivalency to price ratio than others because of that ceiling that's been put on it. All right, so that's how rights holders think about pricing in very simple terms, very, very simple. They use these contractual values that are largely driven by ME as a base/a guide, and then they work to market conditions to adjust, okay? So now we're gonna look at this from the brand side and how they actually assess price and think about the value of partnerships from their perspective. So when brands look at a partnership deal, they are primarily objective driven in their assessment of a sponsorship package, okay? So we're gonna take this as a Paycor example again. Paycor is sitting down assessing this deal thinking, can a partnership with the Bengals help me achieve driving preference with NFL fans, making those within Cincinnati more familiar with my brand, improving my perception, securing a key contract, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And normally what they do is they use a combination of a bunch of different data points on that assessment. So looking at all of these data points around the kind of the little chart here, do these help me achieve the goals that I set out? So they'll take those expected impressions and that media equivalency value. Then they'll look at audience overlap and fit, expected impact on business, asset allocation, strength of IP, et cetera. But you can already see there's significantly more metrics that are going into this decision, right, than just that media equivalency piece that drove the pricing on the rights holder side. And no new information here, but rights holders really consider this as a part of their sales process, but they don't really consider this as an impact on price. There is no objective setting price. Objectives are not necessarily even considered in the price specifically. So let's go back to this kind of example from our $5,000 Paycor. If you were a marketing manager, would you pay $5,000 for this exposure? And this is kind of the way that we would think about it from a brand perspective. So if these are my specific objectives that I am trying to achieve as a brand, and I'm looking at that $5,000, I want to deliver impressions that are uniquely incremental, I want to drive preference, and I want to make those within Cincinnati more familiar with my brand, I would probably pay the Bengals $5K for that specific signage asset. If these were my objectives, as we were kind of talking about earlier, the answer is probably no. I would not pay the Bengals $5,000 for that signage asset if I want to secure a key contract with somebody at Procter & Gamble, or if I want to drive incremental volume on a national level. I could probably spend that money either in other marketing assets or within other assets within the Cincinnati deal specifically. So we're just going to take a pause for a question. Can anybody think of a reason that this objective-based approach isn't used for the purposes of pricing when it is clearly what brands actually think about in terms of assessing a deal? Yeah, go for it.
I don't know if this is like the answer, but it's kind of a question in the same way that wouldn't you want to price out every single exposure from field goals versus one exposure?
Yeah, 100%. And to be clear, that's normally how you would do that for sure. The very rudimentary example of looking at the one $5,000 exposure, we'd be looking at it on the, would I pay for $300,000 worth of that signage, right, for example. But yes, you would definitely do that. Yeah. Yeah, 100%. It's fucking hard, to be honest with you. So how do you actually quantify the price of the impact of the sponsorship on an objective, right? How many dollars does it take to actually move the needle 1 percentage point on consideration? How much is that worth to a brand? It is really, really hard. There's a couple of kind of other examples here. It's case specific, right? Every single brand is going to have different objectives. So designing a pricing system as a rights holder just adds to that level of difficulty a lot. Thirdly, it's novel. Contractual value is the pricing tool that's commonly accepted. It's easy to compare across the industry. When you introduce a pricing system like this, it's just going to be met with skepticism and increased scrutiny, which makes it harder to validate the pricing with. So respect to any rights holder that figures this out for the first time, because that is going to be an uphill journey, but I fight for you guys seriously, because it would be a great change. And then finally, what we were kind of talking about before is this idea of media equivalent value is industry accepted across the entire marketing industry. It's not necessarily just sports sponsorships, right? But it gives you a very easy way to compare your sponsorship package to a TV commercial, to a social media asset. And at the end of the day, sports sponsorships are competing with marketing budgets, okay? That's always what we got to think about is if you're a brand, you have $1 million to assign, how much are you going to put towards sports sponsorships versus Facebook posts to creators, to entertainment partnerships, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. On the measurement side of this as well, we're going to go on a little bit of a journey on measurement. Return on objectives also isn't perfect, and this adds additional difficulty to this situation. So brands and rights holders alike typically use what are called brand lift studies to kind of tease out these business impact metrics, but the process is actually fraught with a ton of issues that we see day to day on a typical basis. So data quality and inconsistency is really the first one, and this happens across all streams of data. I'm sure player analytics deals with this as well, right? But data quality and inconsistency is always just an issue that we have to deal with. Online survey panels are generally used for these brand list studies, and they're really useful, but there are tons of industry accepted pitfalls with using them. I'm not going to go into them here. You guys can read about it. There's tons of them. But metric inflation is really the one that we struggle with the most. And what it does is it creates additional complexity when you're comparing data sets that were sourced differently. So this chart on the right here is actually from some work that we did, but you can see that this top line of, I think it's Atletico Madrid fans, was from an online panel, and the two lines on the bottom were from Tottenham fans and Red Bull Leipzig fans. Those were from a database, okay? These partnerships all started at basically the same time. They have very, very similar assets. There is no reason for us to believe that Atletico Madrid is outperforming the other two so significantly just because it is a Spanish football team, for example, right? We would probably assume that the other two trend in a very similar direction. And then if you look at the usage data point specifically, that's where you start to go, okay, is this really serious? They're outperforming by 17 percentage points or whatever it is. That is just crazy. So we run into that issue big time when it comes to data quality on measuring return on objectives. And then similarly, we have this phenomenon at Wasserman that we call the feel-good fan effect. And we see this again mainly in online panels, but fans of sports teams are they're happy-go-lucky people, especially when they're answering surveys about their favorite team. And what we see is that fans of those teams are generally more favorable to all brands, not just sponsors, when you compare them to non-fans. And that makes comparisons really hard. So let's look at this chart right here. This data looks absolutely amazing. Like there is a 30 percentage point lift on sentiment, brand consideration, intent to buy, and intent to sell for this specific sponsor. That would be like the dream chart to put in a recap as a rights holder for your brands. But when we contextualize the data, there is no lift in this partnership, right? Because when we look at this competitor line, these fans are just more favorable to the competitor as well, like they are to the sponsor. So once that's normalized, that is completely removed. It's very sad for the sponsoring brand. The good thing is good analysis can get around these issues. There's plenty of other things that we can do as well. But to be honest, most of the people who are actually involved in the buying and selling of partnerships don't understand these nuances, okay? Partnerships are not, the handshaking and the negotiation is not done by insights and analytics people. It is done typically by partnership managers, salespeople, new business, et cetera, et cetera. So they don't understand these. They take this chart from 2 months ago and they put it in a deck and it looks absolutely awesome. They ignore this chart, right? Because you don't want to put this into a sales deck. It's just not, it's not good. And that really takes us to, I would say, kind of the crux of the problem. Why would you want to, right? If you're a rights holder and you're trying to secure a sponsor renewal, which chart would you show in a recap deck? I would show the one on the left. The data is actually correct. It's just completely disingenuous, right? Because it's not being normalized against competitors. But the data is there. You can use that data. It hasn't been gathered in a wrong way. It's just being contextualized very, very poorly. And then even on the brand side, if you're a partnerships budget owner at a brand and you're trying to justify your budget for the year to keep your job, which chart would you circulate internally? Again, I would circulate the one on the left. I'm not going to circulate the one on the right. I mean, I wouldn't personally because I work in insights and analytics, but I can understand a partnership marketing person who would choose the one on the left versus the one on the right. And what this basically leaves us with is a super fragmented landscape on the value of sports sponsorships and how it can inform price. So where do we actually go from here? There's 3 trends that I think we're looking at that I would say impact this relatively significantly and hopefully represent the future of the way that this price value kind of dynamic works. The first is on ROI attribution. So if we take away contractual value and we take away return on objectives, return on investment, so the ability to generate $2 on every dollar that you invest in the deal, that is an even playing field if the methodology is consistent, okay? Any partnership packages that have been previously seen as underpriced or undervalued would actually theoretically deliver the highest ROI, and that just creates a more efficient marketplace, okay? So that's one trend we're seeing. I think Jess actually, for anybody who went to her panel yesterday, said she saw this as a trend as well, and we think it's becoming much more common to this second point on the brand side with these bespoke brand models. And marketing tools are evolving, marketers are getting more sophisticated. I think we're going to see more bespoke evaluation and measurement tools on the brand side specifically because they have the money and the resources to build them out that empower them to evaluate deals based on their objectives and their revenue systems, et cetera, and look at them from a brand business impact perspective versus a value perspective like we've been seeing now. And then finally, an interesting thing that I think we saw in the social ecosystem over the last 5 years is social media has actually moved away from the idea of efficiency. When you go out and you strike a deal with a creator, typically that prices at like $100 CPM, and a standard Facebook ad is $4. The thing is you're delivering such outsized engagement that efficiency actually doesn't even matter anymore. I'm looking to effectively reach a smaller audience that's more engaged. So not sure if this is going to lead to actually a new pricing model in general, but rights holders with highly engaged followings are probably going to find it an easy idea to just sell on this effectiveness idea than on reach specifically, just because of that shift in the social ecosystem. So for those who are early in the industry or students here, what can you guys actually do to help and develop this system in the future? So I think there's 4 kind of pieces of advice that I would give you guys is understanding the utility and the drawbacks of media equivalency as a driver of contractual value. As we said, it has its uses, right? But using it as a primary driver for pricing or assessing the price of a package, if you're on the brand side, is kind of a trap, and it's not necessarily correlated to performance. The second is focus on how a package might impact a sponsor's business or your own business if you're on the brand side. So impact and fandom data is used a ton in sales pitches, as we talked about, but it isn't really often used in renewal conversations or added to proposals. I personally love performance-based incentives in contracts. I think they're cool. Like for every percentage point that you increase consideration year over year, that's an extra $100,000 that the brand has to pay you. You could even, if you're confident as a rights holder, you could start your contract at 0, and for every single percentage point that you lift, as long as the data has integrity, you could move to a system like that. I think thirdly is just be a good steward of data. Storytelling around impact of a sponsorship is only good if you're a critic of the data. Performance that looks too good is often met with skepticism. I see this on the brand side all the time. When you're a rights holder and you're delivering 40 percentage point increases in brand metrics, they just don't believe it, like, to be completely honest. So you need some really, really good analysts talking to that data point if you actually have that data point, because it is always met with skepticism. And then the final is push the envelope. The industry is honestly stuck in this pricing and value cycle right now. As I said, it's going to take a very brave rights holder to go out and actually try a new system to move away from this. So we need people to be brave and move away from this on both the brands and the rights holder side. Thanks. Any questions?
Hey, on the you said things are moving towards ROI attribution. Can you talk more tactically about how that works for different type of assets? So, like, how do you are you actually measuring it for something that really can only where media equivalency is like just such a high? It's just so easy to compare it to something.
We don't look at it on the asset level. We look at it on the contract/partnership package level. So is your partnership with the Cincinnati Bengals moving the needle on volume and generating revenue off of the back of that? It's a sum of its parts approach, right? Signage is going to help with that. Hospitality should help with that. All of the pieces should work together to ultimately drive revenue back. And it goes back to constructing a package as well, right? If you understand the brand's objectives, you should be able to put together a package that is better at generating revenue back. So taking Paycor as an example, if I was putting together that deal, I would have done a ton of hospitality stuff. I would have done anything that could help me secure key contracts with Fortune 500 companies in the Cincinnati market. That would drive revenue, right? Because that's the way that it's going to meet those objectives for the client.
Hi, great presentation. I'm super curious about the valuation when it comes to social media. So obviously in today's day and age, the virality of things are pretty unpredictable. And I was curious if that's a consideration when one valuing, but then looking back and trying to train a model on that and kind of the outliers behind that. I was curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a good question. I could talk about this for like hours because social valuation methodology to me is really interesting. It's very hard to do it from a predictive basis. So what you're going to see in most pre-partnership valuations is that it is some kind of a ratio or model that is based on expected engagement or expected impressions over the course of a season. When we look back on it, I can't necessarily talk to how others do this in the industry, but when we look back on it, we actually take the engagements of every single post and we measure on an engagement basis instead of an impression basis. Or what we try and do is model the impressions based on the engagements. So what that would mean is if you have a post that goes viral and it has 10,000 engagements, it's going to be worth significantly more than a run-of-the-mill post that has 1,000. But from a predictive pre-sale environment perspective, it's really hard because you just don't know what's going to go viral and what's not going to.
Thank you. Really appreciate your presentation. Kind of a similar question on the social engagement piece, especially as a lot of the platforms change how they're tracking impressions. How, from like a rights holder perspective, would you be able to show conversion on posts to brands or derived value on actual, like beyond the engagement level, but on actual like conversion for a brand's deal on digital platforms?
Yeah, it's hard. I would say the step that I think that people should be looking to take in the future is, from a rights holder perspective, understanding what the brand's objective is with the social and then using that metric as the way to value the post. So right now, everything is valued on a CPM basis for the most part. If you are working with a client who is a cost per lead or cost per click person, you really should be looking at using that as the baseline metric. And then on the back end, as a rights holder, you get all the access to your social post that you post on your page. If you set it up as a click-based post, you should be reporting back on a cost per click value basis, not on a cost per impression basis. That doesn't necessarily happen right now because, again, things have been done a certain way for a long time, and I think people are a little scared to get out of that because it works, and it's the way the rest of the industry does. But the tools exist right now to do that. It is just getting better about looking into specific objectives and using the right value point from that perspective.
Hey there, question for you. When you're talking about potentially breaking into new markets or with new strategies and things where maybe there isn't a lot of data that you can historically compare to, then how do you kind of pivot and figure out what the valuation is when there isn't necessarily the data that you would expect for more established POVs?
Yeah, it's very, very difficult. If you don't have any kind of benchmarks or comps to work with, we work with on venues, like alternative venues a lot that go with this. You kind of just have to go back to the media equivalency process and think about it in the same way, right? Let's say that you are valuing a theater, okay? Because somebody wants to sponsor the Rockettes is a great example. There are still 50,000 people going through that every couple of nights, et cetera. You can still use a CPM basis, impression-based basis to actually value that work out. I think the hard thing is that it's a great question because what the future of those valuations look like is we want to get to a point where we can model out the impact on the business. And right now that doesn't exist at all in any capacity for most partnerships. So it's kind of a bad answer, but you typically just have to defer to what the industry standard is right now, because at the end of the day, the impression basis approach or the media equivalency approach still works from that perspective.
Appreciate you being here. This was a great presentation. You mentioned pushing the envelope on pricing models for rights holders and sponsors. What does this potentially look like for you? I was trying to think back here what that looked like. Is it a revenue sharing model where we do well, you do well, with nothing really guaranteed? What does that look like, pushing the envelope?
I think that is a great idea and super novel, and I really like it. I really like the performance-based incentive side. So basically starting contracts, and this would be very, very scary as a rights holder, but basically starting contracts at 0, and for every percentage point that you move the needle on their objectives, adding multipliers to that contractual value, right? And that could be even back to your comment on revenue specifically, that could be based off if this brand knows that 1 point of consideration generates, I don't know, $2 million of revenue for their business in the US, you could actually use that as the underlying way to calculate that value, right? We're not going to charge $2 million, but there is something there on the objective side, the revenue generation side, et cetera, that hasn't really been factored in right now. I actually personally think that sports sponsorships are super undervalued, just to be very, very clear in this room, because they've been playing into this idea of the paid media metrics instead of the effectiveness metrics. So I think that if the industry moved to, revenue sharing model, a performance-based model, something like that, I actually think that we would see sponsorships massively inflate in price from that perspective, because I think that their effectiveness is being undersold right now by looking at it from the contractual value perspective.
From the perspective of a rights holder, how do you combat that ROI, kind of the positioning where you're going to show one side of the data that's not necessarily contextual, when you don't have that contextual data from the brand saying, hey, this is how much revenue we are generating from this, because from the property end, you don't always get that. You
don't. That's the problem, honestly, is like that is what is at the crux of this issue is there is no, it is very, very difficult, I would actually say impossible, to model this data effectively without brand side data. And we get caught in traps all the time trying to have to justify the price because the media equivalency value is not there. But we think we're having an impact on the business. We probably know, but data missing is a huge piece that's at the crux of this problem, because we just don't have the ability to validate it right now. That's why I would say is like rights holders need their measurement tech stack. I actually think that they should be investing heavier in their measurement tech stack than they are right now. Anything on ROI attribution, et cetera, is a huge one to close that. But it is much easier to justify a price in a negotiation if you have a lower media equivalency value delivered, if you can say that you increase purchase intent by 4 percentage points. So that is not the solution, but it is part of the way there, and it's the numbers together that help tell that story. But good question.
Hey. Yeah, so you mentioned that a brand should consider the value of the partnership based off what their objective is.
Yeah.
Are there certain objectives that you would say are easier to measure the effectiveness of versus certain ones where maybe you should just rule it out because you won't be able to understand the possible impact?
anything brand health is normally really easy, to be honest. The problem is not necessarily to do with the actual gathering of the data or the things that we went through before. It's on the analysis and the scrutiny of the data. But A/B testing or brand health uplift is an industry-wide accepted practice across the entire marketing and media industry. And it's really funny if you go into any kind of papers about marketing effectiveness and marketing efficiency, all this kind of stuff, every 3 years they just come back to brand health uplift being the gold standard of measurement, even though they kind of try to change it again and again. So that's the easiest. Being able to talk about consideration, intent uplift, et cetera, is normally a widely accepted practice that you can always lean on in that regard. Where you start to run into issues is going back to the last question, is on when you start to look at specific business metrics, that's where things get really, really cagey. And if you don't have a client that wants to, a brand side client that wants to work with you on that data, it's typically very, very hard to ingest that. So that's why falling back on brand lift is generally good.
For the performance-based model that you're talking about, how do you attribute things like purchase intent, consideration to your specific sponsorship when a brand may have multiple or be doing other things like media-based stuff as well?
So I think it's different. Everybody in the industry does it. I wouldn't say everybody in the industry does it differently. People in the industry do it differently. The way that we look at it from a Wasserman perspective is based on association for the most part. So if you can associate a brand with a partner, we assume that you have been impacted by the partnership. And we also assume those who associate and those who don't associate are served brand's content at a similar rate. There is no reason to think that just because this person has been exposed to the IP of a partnership means that they've been exposed to more marketing content from Coca-Cola than those who haven't, right? So that's how we try to normalize it, but there's no perfect solution when it comes to that. You can't adjust for every single thing that's going on in the market, but association feels the closest to us in terms of removing everything. We also use lookalikes for association versus non-association, so you're eliminating demographic bias, psychographic bias, which could impact the ability for somebody to see other marketing efforts.
Hey, great stuff. Thank you for presenting. My question is, have you seen any rights holders or brands doing more unique solutions when it comes to valuation outside of just the standardized approach?
Yeah, I think the big brand buyers right now are changing things quite rapidly. We are working on something for Coca-Cola right now, and they've basically built their own evaluation system. Right? They don't even use the typical hire an agency to understand the media equivalent return on the contractual price. They have their own tool that they've built internally to evaluate partnerships, which is crazy. I wouldn't be surprised if Procter & Gamble, who is also a big buyer, has been doing that or something similar, but that's what I've seen on the brand side for the most part. I think that the rights holders on the women's side have actually been the most innovative on it because they've been forced to get creative because they don't have the contractual value to use.